Welcome. I'm Professor Jagdish Sheth at Emory University. This presentation is all about how Trump presidency will impact the future of US trade policy. First, I will analyze the real reasons why Trump won the election. It is contrary to every expectations we had, all of the opinions and the pollsters, what they were talking about. I think the real reasons were three: economics, economics, economics. The problem really began almost 25 years ago when, in search for additional global growth after the first energy crisis, the world leaders decided, through G7, G8, for example, to increase and liberalize trade as a growth engine. So we abolished the GATT agreements, which were general tariffs and trade, and we created a whole new organization called WTO, World Trade Organization. This increased trade across the borders led to NAFTA on the one side, European Union on the other side, but in the process, the jobs began to shift. The traditional unions were a strong power, and the majority of the union workers were factory workers at that time. Factories got automated. There was a significant outsourcing to cheaper labor countries, whether it's Mexico, eventually China, whatever they were. So the power of the union began to decline. And there were a strong hold for democratic vote. This vote, Democrats did not get it. And actually, most of them, typical Midwest manufacturing belt or Rust Belt as we call it, all white population began to have a white revolt. The white revolt became very key in the process. It's basically a white right revolt in some fashion. And that had a huge impact on the election in 2016. If this was not enough, it got compounded by the Great Recession of 2007 and 8. Whatever savings the families had made, typical middle-class families, apparently lost everything in their balance sheet. Housing value declined. 401k pension plans, corporate pension plans declined. And all of them had a huge loss on their balance sheet. So there was nothing to fall back on. On top of that, there was no strong economic recovery after the intervention by the government to bail us out from 2008, a Great Recession. Everything was economic. The extreme white right began to also react to the huge extreme left reaction that took place in the nation. Bernie Sanders got enormous large number of young people with liberal attitudes. So this was a counter reaction. I call it an anti-incumbent sentiment. And if this is not all of us enough, we also had a huge Middle East. It was in turmoil. Not only the amount of investment and the loss of life. Remember, loss of life all came majority from the white working class families. That loss was hurting people also. And there was no end to the Middle East crisis, no matter how you analyzed it. Now that the Trump presidency is here, what are the consequences? The first major consequence, of course, is that the Trans-Pacific Partnership is dead on arrival. I don't think it will ever get revitalized, at least for the first term of this president, and maybe all 2 terms if he survives and gets re-elected. Therefore, bilateral trade will replace multilateral trade. The bilateral trade will replace in many ways the NAFTA as we know today. And the European Union, which is a one-block trade with America, also will surprisingly become more and more bilateral. I think we need to watch the bilateral trade very importantly, especially with 5 nations who have been very strong, export-oriented, and a huge balance of payment problem with America. Top of the list is China, but the second one is Germany. Third one is Mexico. Fourth one is Japan. Fifth one is South Korea. Canada is more balanced, but it is still having a trade surplus with America. So if you take the top 5 or 6 nations, the majority of them have a trade imbalance where they are very large net exporters to America and not as much importers from or buyers from America. I think this will be all renegotiated on a bilateral basis. The biggest impact will be surprisingly not as much on the trade and the economic trade theory, which presumed different companies in countries trade with each other. But if you analyze the data, surprisingly from the early 90s, today 35% of all international trade is intra-firm or intra-company trade, which means the same company does some value add in one country, imports the part which is value added, assembles a little more here, exports out again, brings it back into the country. And I saw that at Motorola, for example, as many as 5-6 times the same semiconductor will go from the initial raw material to the finished product for the computer industry, for the cell phone industry. So world trade actually since 1990s is artificial. It is within the firm. And I think the biggest impact will be that the companies, large multinationals, especially US large multinationals, but I think this is a general statement and an observation across all multinationals, rather than doing different things in value add in supply chain, they will all do supply chain value add all in America for the American market, all in Europe for the European market, all in China for the Chinese market, all in India for the Indian market, etc., etc. And that will happen through trade, intra-company trade shifted to intra-company investment. And that includes companies like Apple, for example. Clearly, that's the case for the automotive industry more and more. It'll be the case for appliances and the aircraft industry. So in automobile industry, rather than importing components from someplace, let's say from Canada, assembling in Mexico, for example, and selling into America is the old model. It'll be replaced by everything made in America, everything made in Mexico, everything made in Canada, if Canada is big enough market. And you have seen the same thing about EADS, the Airbus parent company, now assembling their aircraft, commercial aircraft, and maybe the military aircraft eventually in Mobile, Alabama. All 5 German automobile makers, not because of the Trump presidency, but for whatever reason, have now become major investors in America. They do all the automobile assembly in America rather than export from Germany. So just watch the trend. I think it's very significant that the biggest impact is going to be on intra-company trade. I think Trump presidency will emulate Ronald Reagan's global competitiveness policy. Ronald Reagan began to talk about how there is unfair competition from the rest of the world, and especially he targeted Japan as the poster boy of bad behavior, unfair competition. So his point of view was that we should have fair competition, level playing field, and America did not have the level playing field. So he began to really strongly pressure Japanese economy to invest in America, which led to, obviously, the 3 large automobile makers, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, all investing in America, building assembly plants, their suppliers all coming over here, and rest is the history. Today, the auto industry is as heavily invested by or owned by the Japanese as it is by the Americans, and now, of course, the Germans, as I mentioned. Instead of Japan, under Trump policy, the target is going to be China, and the target is going to be Germany, and the target is going to be South Korea once its politics are stable, which is very important. So China now will be pressured to invest heavily in America, despite ideological differences, probably the potential military rivalry, and even a soft power rivalry between China and the United States. Behind the scenes, I strongly expect Chinese enterprises to massively invest in America. We have already seen the tip of the iceberg, where the General Electric in the appliance business, the second largest appliance maker in America and worldwide, is bought out by Haier, which is a Chinese corporation. We'll see similarly Chinese PC maker like a Lenovo not only having IBM think tank, but investing more massively in America. It just goes on for every large Chinese multinational, most of them state-owned, both in the raw materials such as steel, aluminum, but also in fact in finished goods, consumer electronics, for example. And that is true of South Korea with its brands like LG, for example, or Samsung. So watch the trend that more and more export-oriented economies, especially the 5-6 that I talked about, will be shifting their policy toward investing in America. Reagan did one more thing. He said bureaucracy is too much for whatever reason. It happened probably due to energy crisis of 74, 78. We give enormous powers to Environmental Protection Agency. For whatever reason, Reagan decided that he will liberalize, continue the privatization and liberalization that began under Carter administration. Remember the Big Bang Theory, where there was a wholesale deregulation of the airline industry, the utility industry, the electric utility industry, for example, where the power generation was separated from power distribution and power retailing. And you can analyze the trucking industry and everything. Reagan continued to say we need to deregulate more and let the private sector take over more and more the responsibility and accountability for creating economic growth. Government should not be in the business of constraining the private sector. So there is a similar move by Trump administration about too much regulation that came in the last 8 years of Obama presidency, for example. And how do you undo that thing, such as Healthcare Affordable Care Act, or what is called Obamacare? Similarly, banking services, the new regulations that came in, Frank-Dodd regulation as it is called. We abolished the Glass-Steagall Act, for example, at one time. How do you get that, again, deregulated or less simplify government rules and regulations? And that is definitely going to happen with the Environmental Protection Agency, with the appointment of the secretary for the EPA industry or EPA regulation. Reagan did one more thing. He strongly advocated what he called new federalism, that the role of the central government is primarily, in fact, defense, that the states must have more and more autonomy on the social as well as economic development of their own citizens in their states. Federal government can enable and assist, but the initiatives must come from the state. And obviously one would attribute this to Reagan's own management of California when he was the governor and what he might have encountered. But this is going to be, again, major shift in the US policy following Reagan administration. Reagan administration also decided to invest heavily in infrastructure, put the gasoline tax, for example, and that led to all the interstate highways repair, bridges being repaired. They were all, in fact, deferred maintenance. Not only new construction, but deferred maintenance. I think you are going to see the same policy here under Trump administration, but the infrastructure would be escalated to a much larger level based upon the fiscal policy of the government, but it'll take a huge share away from other programs such as social programs. And of course, what you see in some ways is surprisingly, despite the political party and the ideology, this sounds more and more like Keynesian economics to people who are basically economists. That use public money, as we have done with municipal bonds in states, for example, to build new state highways, if nothing else, toll highways, the turnpikes of the world, I think is going to happen more and more at a national level. And the last thing Reagan administration did, which I think is going to happen, is to convert the public debt, which is the treasury bonds, from countries that own those debts, which means they have lent money to us, multi-trillion dollars. China leads the way, but so does Saudi Arabia. So does, in fact, Japan. They will be all asked to convert their public debt or treasury into private equity. Invest in America through private equity of some form. Sovereign funds can do it, for example. There are so many mechanisms. And therefore, private equity people will have a huge heyday going forward. More likely, companies like Blackstone today are not just Goldman Sachs. So this is the key change. Let me articulate now how the world will react to this US trade policy, which says shift from multilateral to bilateral trade, and shift from trade to investment. Make investment in America more attractive, however you do it by and large. States all have the right to give tax incentives to attract investments. Whatever mechanism you do, simplify the rules and regulations, however you do it. My view is that the world now will react back by going back to pre-WTO days. Remember, before the WTO in the 90s, most of the international aspects were done through investment, not through trade. You had to form subsidiaries in different countries. Before the European Union, for example, American corporations had to have subsidiary in each country. In fact, I was advisor to several European multinationals, and they were saying that with all of the energy crisis and the cost savings, outsourcing, downsizing, right-sizing, we can't afford to have a separate subsidiary in Norway and in Denmark and in Sweden. Cannot not just have a Norwegian, let's say, one subsidiary for all of Scandinavia. These are the debates we were going through at that time, before the European Union came into existence. Just as the European multinationals consolidated their headquarters pan-European, I think we are going to go back to that regime, that model, all over the world. Export-oriented economies, therefore, will shift to foreign investments all over the world. And again, China will lead the way, is my forecast. Germany will lead the way, is my forecast. And Japan will lead the way. So will Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, for example, because United Arab Emirates, they have a huge surplus. And Middle East is very important to watch for attracting this investment, because in the latest amount of price rise of the oil to $100 per barrel, the total windfall is about $4.5 trillion as compared to the first energy crisis, where the windfall was only $250 billion, mostly with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. The new windfall actually is shared by at least a dozen countries. That includes Mexico, Venezuela, for example. That includes Brunei. That includes Russia. That includes all the economies who had a huge windfall because their cost did not go up in extracting the oil, just the price went up. Keep that in the back of your mind. And direct investment will replace trade worldwide. And Japan's investment worldwide, as I mentioned, Korea will follow, China's global expansion, and surprisingly to me, India will become a major destination for foreign direct investment. Partly because you do have a very stable economy, a stable leadership, stable political party, who is likely to win in re-election. It looks like all the handwriting seems to be on wall. It has become more and more investor friendly. There's a single guidance mechanism, window guidance as we call it, and it is a large economy, just surpassed United Kingdom, bigger than UK in the traditional GDP measure, and of course in the PPP measure, it is already in fact number 3 economy. Given that size of that economy, about to modernize, unbranded consumption becoming more and more branded consumption, rise of the middle class, this is just the consumer economy. Then you talk about the defense, major defense spending by the government. Huge improvement on infrastructure like modernizing the railway systems, building new roads, building new ports, building new airports. It's a massive opportunity on the defense side, on the infrastructure side, consumer economy, and of course, services economy. So my own view is that more and more rest of the world will invest in India, both in manufacturing as well as in services, and also agricultural sector. Rather than export agricultural raw materials, you will actually do value add and export out of India or consume in India more and more. India is a large potential market. In fact, in the purchasing power parity measure, it probably is more than $3.5–4 trillion just the consumer market. So one is watching India as a major investment destination. In fact, in 2017, India has now become the largest single destination for investment, crossing more than $50 billion and surpassing both America and China, which is unthinkable or was unthinkable only about 5, maybe 7 years ago. I think Trump presidency and the change in the US trade policy will have a significant impact in the geopolitics of the world. Fundamentally, who are our friends will become not so our friends. And that's the continental Europeans. The Europeans have always felt that since World War II, they were primarily influenced by American policymakers, both political, military, and economic. They need to take charge of their own continent. So my view is that the Franco-German coalition, with the British out, will take a leadership role, unite as much as possible, and will distance itself from America and its policies. It is not America who will distance from European Union, it is the European Union who will distance from America. Also in the process, since Brexit is real, it has already taken place, United Kingdom surprisingly will be uncoupling more and more with Europe, which is coupled only recently, and will go back to its coupling back to the Commonwealth nations, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and other emerging economies, but also very big way with United States. United States is a very large potential market. The trade of $100 billion that UK has with United States can be ramped up to $500 billion easily. And of course, large British companies can invest heavily into the United States. And that includes the defense sector, for example. That includes, in my view, the aerospace industry. That includes, for example, British Telecom, British Airways, etc., etc. And of course, many professional services. Remember, some of the largest ad agencies are UK headquartered. WPP as an example, and I can give you many more examples. That's a huge new geopolitical shift. Similarly, our foes will become our friends, and that is surprisingly Russia. My own view is that United States needs Russia more today than ever. From a very pragmatic viewpoint, one has to forget the Cold War and the mistrust, because to bail out from the Middle East, and one has to bail out, only superpower that can come and provide an external stability in the Middle East is likely to be Russia, not China. While China is capable, Russia has not only capability but willingness to do it. So that's a huge geopolitical shift, and I'm pretty confident about my forecast about that particular phenomenon. So here is a foe that becomes a friend. And that will be true of many countries. Some from the Middle East, some from Russia, and definitely from Asia. My second major geopolitical analysis leads me to the conclusion that Asia will become the new battleground, not the Middle East, not Europe, not Latin America, and not Africa. It is the hotbed. If there is any major military crisis of the nature of the kind like world wars, it is more likely to happen in Asia than it's going to happen in any other place in the world. And once it happens, it'll be out of control. It is like starting a fire innocently or intentionally in the brittle land, the dry land of the Arizonas or the California in America, and the wildfire just gets out of hand. And by the way, it is no longer limited to California. We have wildfires in Georgia, for example, or northern Florida, for example. It can happen any place. So it may be unpredictable places in Asia where a military confrontation happens, and once it happens, it is likely to get out of hand. So my second major geopolitical analysis says that Asia will be the new battleground, and what can the world do to prevent this from happening rather than escalate how it happens? As I mentioned, there is a brighter side of Brexit. And I will probably have a separate analysis on future of United Kingdom or England post-Brexit. I think it's very fascinating. My conclusion is that England will do very well, surprisingly, better than what it has done with European Union. If you analyze the data, both trade and investment, actually it turns out to be Britain will be better off in many ways, realigning itself geopolitically outside of the European Union, which it has no choice now, it looks like. And you will see the rise of new triad power. The old triad power used to be the 12 common market nations, America and Canada, and Japan as a late entrant after World War II as the largest economies. They did more trade with each other, they did more investment with each other, etc. They definitely did more value add. 70% of the GDP was concentrated in the hands of these 12 or 15 nations as of mid-80s. Think about that. Today, that triad power begins to shift, and the new triad power will be China, India, and United States. These three are the largest markets based on PPP measure. They have the fastest growth. That includes United States, surprisingly to us, and therefore the new triad power and the interplay between India, China, and America will shape the future geopolitics and the policy of the nations. Unlike the previous triad power, because America defeated Japan and Germany, we had a little more harmonious view about world institutions like IMF, World Bank, etc. We had a harmonious view about how to engage with each other in a political process through United Nations or otherwise. NATO alliance, a common defense alliance against in the Cold War era, that is not the future. China has a communist legacy. It has a different perspective. India was organized as a socialistic society, or basically socialism dominated there, where pure capitalism was not the mission of the country. And of course, America always has been what I call cowboy capitalism, extreme capitalism, where you trust capitalism until it fails. Bringing these three ideologies together, as these three economies become superpowers going forward, is going to be a major challenge, but also an opportunity. So geopolitics will also change. So let me conclude this presentation. Trump presidency will bring tectonic shifts from multilateral to bilateral trade, from trade to investment, and from Europe to Asia-centric geopolitics. Thank you.